Some 18 years ago, the author of this course made his first trip to the little town of Lumberport, West Virginia. At that time, the only means of transportation leading from Clarksburg, the largest nearby center, to Lumberport was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and an interurban electric line which ran 3 miles of the town. One could walk the 3 miles if he chose. Upon arriving at Clarksburg, I found that the only train going to Lumberport in the forenoon had already gone, and not wishing to wait for the later afternoon train, I made the trip by trolley with the intention of walking the 3 miles. On the way down, the rain began to pour, and those 3 miles had to be navigated on foot through deep yellow mud. When I arrived at Lumberport, my shoes and pants were muddy, and my disposition was none the better for the experience. The first person I met was V.L. Horner, who was then cashier of the Lumberport Bank. In a rather loud tone of voice, I asked of him, "Why do you not get that trolley line extended from the junction over to Lumberport so your friends can get in and out of town without drowning in mud?" "Did you see a river with high banks at the edge of the town as you came in?" he asked. I replied that I had seen it. "Well," he continued, "that's the reason we have no streetcars running into town. The cost of a bridge would be about $100,000, and that is more than the company owning the trolley line is willing to invest. We have been trying for 10 years to get them to build a line into town." "Trying?" I exploded. "How hard have you tried?" "We have offered them every inducement we could afford, such as free right-of-way from the junction into the town and free use of the streets, but that bridge is the stumbling block. They simply will not stand the expense, claim they cannot afford such an expense for the small amount of revenue they would receive from the 3-mile extension." Then the law of success philosophy began to come to my rescue. I asked Mr. Horner if he would take a walk over to the river with me, that we might look at the spot that was causing so much inconvenience. He said he would be glad to do so. When we got to the river, I began to take inventory of everything in sight. I observed that the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad tracks ran up and down the river banks on both sides of the river, that the county road crossed the river on a rickety wooden bridge, both approaches to which were over several strands of railroad track, as the railroad company had its switching yards at that point. While we were standing there, a freight train blocked the crossing, and several teams stopped on both sides of the train, waiting for an opportunity to get through. The train kept the road blocked for about 25 minutes. With this combination of circumstances in mind, it required but little imagination to see that 3 different parties were or could be interested in the building of the bridge, such as would be needed to carry the weight of a streetcar. It was obvious that the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company would be interested in such a bridge because that would remove the county road from their switching tracks and save them a possible accident on the crossing, to say nothing of much loss of time and expense in cutting trains to allow teams to pass. It was also obvious that the county commissioners would be interested in the bridge because it would raise the county road to a better level and make it more serviceable to the public. And of course, the street railway company was interested in the bridge, but it did not wish to pay the entire cost. All these facts passed through my mind as I stood there and watched the freight train being cut for the traffic to pass through. A definite chief aim took place in my mind. Also a definite plan for its attainment. The next day I got together a committee of townspeople consisting of the mayor, councilman, and some leading citizens, and called on the division superintendent of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company at Grafton. We convinced him that it was worth 1/3 of the cost of the bridge to get the county road off his company's tracks. Next we went to the county commissioners and found them to be quite enthusiastic over the possibility of getting a new bridge by paying for only 1/3 of it. They promised to pay their 1/3 providing we could arrange for the other 2/3. We then went to the president of the traction company that owned the trolley line at Fairmount, and laid before him an offer to donate all the rights of way and pay for 2/3 of the cost of the bridge, providing he would begin building the line into town promptly. We found him receptive also. 3 weeks later, a contract had been signed between the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, the Monongahela Valley Traction Company, and the county commissioners of Harrison County, providing for the construction of the bridge, 1/3 of its cost to be paid by each. 2 months later, the right-of-way was being graded and the bridge was underway, and 3 months after that, streetcars were running into Lumberport on regular schedule. This incident meant much to the town of Lumberport because it provided transportation that enabled people to get in and out of the town without undue effort. It also meant a great deal to me because it served to introduce me as one who got things done. Two very definite advantages resulted from this transaction. The chief counsel for the traction company gave me a position as his assistant, and later on it was the means of an introduction which led to my appointment as the advertising manager of the LaSalle Extension University. Lumberport, West Virginia was then and still is a small town, and Chicago was a large city and located a considerable distance away, but news of initiative and leadership has a way of taking on wings and traveling. 4 of the 15 laws of success were combined in the transaction described, namely, a definite chief aim, self-confidence, imagination and initiative and leadership. The law of doing more than paid for also entered somewhat into the transaction because I was not offered anything and in fact did not expect pay for what I did. To be perfectly frank, I appointed myself to the job of getting the bridge built more as a sort of challenge to those who said it could not be done than I did with the expectation of getting paid for it. By my attitude, I rather intimated to Mr. Horner that I could get the job done, and he was not slow to snap me up and put me to the test. It may be helpful to call attention here to the part which imagination played in this transaction. For 10 years, the townspeople of Lumberport had been trying to get a streetcar line built into town. It must not be concluded that the town was without men of ability, because that would be inaccurate. In fact, there were many men of ability in the town, but they had been making the mistake which is so commonly made by us all, of trying to solve their problem through one single source, whereas there were actually 3 sources of solution available to them. $100,000 was too much for one company to assume for the construction of a bridge, but when the cost was distributed between 3 interested parties, the amount to be borne by each was more reasonable. The question might be asked, why did not some of the local townsmen think of this 3-way solution? In the first place, they were so close to their problem that they failed to take a prospective bird's-eye view of it, which would have suggested the solution. This also is a common mistake, and one that is always avoided by great leaders. In the second place, these townspeople had never before coordinated their efforts or worked as an organized group with the sole purpose in mind of finding a way to get a streetcar line built into town. This also is another common error made by men in all walks of life, that of failure to work in unison, in a thorough spirit of cooperation. I, being an outsider, had less difficulty in getting cooperative action than one of their own group might have had. Too often there is a spirit of selfishness in small communities which prompts each individual to think that his ideas should prevail. It is an important part of the leader's responsibility to induce people to subordinate their own ideas and interests for the good of the whole, and this applies to matters of a civic, business, social, political, financial, or industrial nature. Success, no matter what may be one's conception of that term, is nearly always a question of one's ability to get others to subordinate their own individualities and follow a leader. The leader who has the personality and the imagination to induce his followers to accept his plans and carry them out faithfully is always an able leader. The next lesson, on imagination, will take you still further into the art of tactful leadership. In fact, leadership and imagination are so closely allied and so essential for success that one cannot be successfully applied without the other. Initiative is the moving force that pushes the leader ahead, but imagination is the guiding spirit that tells him which way to go. Imagination enabled the author of this course to analyze the Lumberport Bridge problem, break it up into its 3 component parts, and assemble these parts in a practical working plan. Nearly every problem may be so broken up into parts which are more easily managed as parts than they are when assembled as a whole. Perhaps one of the most important advantages of imagination is that it enables one to separate all problems into their component parts and to reassemble them in more favorable combinations. It has been said that all battles in warfare are won or lost, not on the firing line after the battle begins, but back of the lines, through the sound strategy, or the lack of it, used by the generals who plan the battles. What is true of warfare is equally true in business, and in most other problems which confront us throughout life. We win or lose according to the nature of the plans we build and carry out, a fact which serves to emphasize the value of the laws of initiative and leadership, imagination, self-confidence, and a definite chief aim. With the intelligent use of these 4 laws, one may build plans for any purpose whatsoever, which cannot be defeated by any person or group of persons who do not employ or understand these laws. There is no escape from the truth here stated. Organized effort is effort which is directed according to a plan that was conceived with the aim of imagination, guided by a definite chief aim, and given momentum with initiative and self-confidence. These 4 laws blend into one and become a power in the hands of a leader. Without their aid, effective leadership is impossible. You are now ready for the lesson on imagination. Read that lesson with the thought in mind of all that has here been stated, and it will take on a deeper meaning. Time is the mighty hand that rocks the eternal cradle of progress and nurses struggling humanity through that period when man needs protection against his own ignorance. Life is not a goblet to be drained. It is a measure to be filled. Hadley. Intolerance. An after-the-lesson visit with the author.